Welcome and thank you for joining us today. We have a new story for you, written by Nora Calloway. It is called The Recipe in the Blue Book. Find a comfortable place, take your time, and let us begin. Act 1. The Book. The book had been on the shelf for so long that Daniel had stopped seeing it. This was the thing about objects that stayed in one place across many years. They became part of the architecture of a room, as invisible as the trim around a door frame or the worn pattern of the rug underfoot. Daniel had looked at that shelf 10,000 times without seeing the blue book, and now here he was, 66 years old, standing on a step stool in his kitchen trying to reach the back of the top shelf where he was fairly certain he had once stored a box of birthday candles, and his hand closed around the spine of something, and he pulled it down, and it was not the candles. It was a cookbook, slim, cloth-covered, the color of a summer sky that has been washed a few too many times, no title on the spine. He stepped down from the stool and turned it over in his hands. On the front cover, in faded gold letters, Collected Recipes, Volume 2. He did not know where Volume 1 was. He was not sure he had ever known. He opened it. The handwriting hit him before anything else, not the recipes on the printed pages, not the ingredients in their neat columns, but the handwriting in the margins. Small and slanted and entirely familiar, even after 13 years. His mother's handwriting filling every white border of every page with notes he had never read. Too much salt, better with less butter. Daniel liked this one. Try it with the good apples from the far side of the orchard. Make for Christmas. He stood in his kitchen holding the book and did not move for a long time. His mother, June Avery, had died 13 years ago at the age of 80 in the farmhouse where she had lived for 54 years in the same county where she had been born and where her own mother had been born before her. Daniel had grown up in that farmhouse, left it at 23 to take a job in the city, come back on holidays and long summer weekends, and eventually less often than he should have, the way adult children drift from home when their own lives fill up, and the distance between visits seems to matter less than it does. He had cleared the farmhouse with his sister Ruth after the funeral, and he must have brought this book home among the boxes because here it was on his shelf, but he did not remember packing it. There were a lot of things from that week he did not remember clearly. He carried the book to the kitchen table and sat down. He turned the pages slowly. His mother had cooked the way she had done most things, without drama, with great steadiness, and with a kind of quiet authority that never needed to announce itself. The kitchen had been the center of that farmhouse, not architecturally, but in the way a fire is the center of a room, the place everything orients toward. June Avery had spent more hours in that kitchen than in any other room of the house, and Daniel had grown up with the sounds and smells of it, the way you grow up with the sound of your own name, so deeply familiar that you stop registering it as a particular thing. He had eaten her food for 23 years and said, "Thank you," the way a person says thank you for something they expect to continue forever. He looked at the margins. The notes were not written in one session. He could see that from the varying quality of the ink, some entries darker and more decisive, some faded and careful, written at different times over what must have been many years. She had been annotating this book across a long time, returning to it the way you return to something you are still thinking about. He found a page for apple cake near the middle of the book. The margins on this page were fuller than most. He read them in order. working around the printed recipe like reading a clock. First note, old ink, Daniel's birthday, made it 3 times before I got it right. The trick is the brown sugar in the topping, not the white. Second note, darker ink, written at a different angle as if she had turned the book. He called today to say he was not coming for Thanksgiving. I made the cake anyway. It keeps well. Third note, same pen as the second. Made this for his 35th birthday when he drove back for the weekend. He ate 2 pieces and did not ask for the recipe. That is all right. He will want it someday. Daniel put the book down on the table. He looked at the window above the sink where the light was coming in at the particular afternoon angle of mid-October, falling across the floor in a long rectangle the color of old honey. Outside the window, the maple at the end of the yard had gone fully red in the past week, the red of it so vivid it looked almost warm. He thought, she knew that someday he would want it, and she wrote it down and waited. He was 66 years old, and he had not made apple cake once in his adult life. He had eaten it every year for 23 years, and then it had simply stopped existing when she stopped making it, the way so many things stopped existing that he had not noticed until much later. He picked the book up again and read the third note once more. He will want it some day. He got up from the table and went to find his coat. He had not been to a grocery store with a specific purpose in some time. He was a man who shopped the way many people who live alone shop, without a list, choosing things that seemed adequate, never planning more than 2 or 3 days ahead. He drove to the store in the town 15 minutes away and walked the aisles with the book open to the apple cake page, reading the ingredient list carefully. He bought brown sugar and butter and eggs. He stood in the produce section for a while considering the apples, and he chose the ones that looked most like the ones from the far side of the orchard, which was a criterion he could not have explained to anyone but which felt necessary. He drove home in the October afternoon and unloaded the groceries on the kitchen counter and stood looking at them. He had not baked anything in his adult life. He understood this was relevant information. He opened the book again. Act 2, The Afternoon. He called his sister before he began. Ruth answered on the third ring, slightly breathless, which was how Ruth usually answered because she was usually in the middle of something and had not quite decided to stop doing it yet. He told her about the book. There was a silence on the line, and then she said, "I remember that book, the blue one. I used to look at it when I was little because I thought the cover was beautiful." He told her about the margins. He read her the 3 notes about the apple cake. There was a longer silence. Ruth said quietly, "She wrote in all of them like that?" He said, "Every page I've looked at, some more than others." Ruth said, "I didn't know. I never looked inside. I just thought it was an ordinary cookbook." He said, "I think I need to make the cake." Ruth said, "I know you do. Call me when it comes out of the oven." He set the phone down on the counter and looked at the ingredients arranged in front of him and the book propped open against the backsplash, and he rolled up his sleeves. He had always believed he was not a person who could cook. This was not something he had tested carefully. It was a belief he had arrived at in his 20s, when cooking had seemed like a skill that belonged to people who had learned it properly, and he had not learned it properly, and that had settled the matter. His mother had cooked. Various other people had cooked. He had eaten what was in front of him and been grateful in the general way that does not require much specific attention. He read the recipe 3 times before he touched anything. His mother's notes were alongside the printed instructions at every step, and he followed both. She had noted that the butter should be truly soft, not just slightly soft, and that the difference mattered more than the recipe admitted. She had noted that the eggs should be room temperature, which he had not considered, and which required him to set them on the counter and wait 20 minutes, which he did, sitting at the table with the book and reading other pages while he waited. He read about her pot roast, which she had made every Sunday for the first 15 years of his life, and which he had apparently requested so consistently as a child that she had written Daniel's standing order beside the recipe with what he recognized as affectionate exasperation. He read about a pie she had made once for a church gathering and not again, with the note, "Never again," which made him laugh aloud. He read about the bread she had baked every week, the margins there fuller than anywhere else in the book, a long conversation with herself about flour ratios and rising times that went on across several revisits, the ink changing, the handwriting varying slightly with the years. He had eaten that bread at every meal for 23 years and never once thought about what went into it. He thought about it now. He went back to the apple cake when the eggs were ready. He creamed the butter and sugar the way the recipe said, and his mother had added in the margin, "This takes longer than you think. Keep going." He kept going. He added the eggs one at a time. He measured the flour, which he had bought because he did not own any, and he sifted it, which his mother had underlined in the printed text, as if she knew that someone would try to skip this step. He cut the apples. He had bought 6 and the recipe called for 4, and he stood at the cutting board, slicing them and thinking about the orchard at the farmhouse, which had been his father's project originally, and which his mother had tended after his father died, not because she was particularly attached to orchards, but because the trees were there and it seemed wrong to let them go untended. He had climbed those trees as a boy. He had eaten apples directly from the branches, standing in the grass in late summer with the juice running down his chin, and he had never once thought to be grateful for the fact that someone had planted those trees, or that someone else had kept them alive. He folded the apples into the batter. He made the topping, the brown sugar and butter, and a pinch of cinnamon that his mother had added in her own hand, not in the printed recipe, but in the margin. Cinnamon, just a little, you will know how much. He did not know how much. He guessed, and the guess felt right. He put the cake in the oven. Then he sat at the kitchen table with the blue book and the October light coming through the window, and he read every page from the beginning. He read for the full hour the cake was baking. He read about meals he remembered and meals he had never known about, and meals she had made for occasions that predated him entirely, notes that referred to people whose names he did not recognize, a world of his mother's life that had existed before he arrived in it and continued alongside him without his having paid it much attention. She had been a full person. He had known this in the general way that you know things you have not examined, but the book made it specific. The book gave it the weight of evidence. She had been thinking and tasting and adjusting and trying again for years and years in a kitchen that smelled of whatever she was making, with her pen in her hand and her thoughts running alongside the work. And he had eaten the results of all that thinking without knowing it was thinking. The timer went. He took the cake out of the oven. It looked, to his considerable surprise, like a cake. It looked, in fact, quite a lot like the cake he remembered. The topping had gone golden, and the edges had pulled slightly from the pan, and the smell of it was so specific, and so complete that he had to stand still for a moment with the oven mitt on his hand and simply breathe. He set it on the counter to cool. He picked up the phone and called Ruth. She answered immediately this time, which meant she had been waiting. He said, "It came out." Ruth said, "What does it look like?" He said, "Like hers?" There was a pause. Ruth said, "Does it smell right?" He said, "Yes." He heard her exhale. She said, "I'm coming over." Act 3, What She Left. Ruth arrived in just under 2 hours, which meant she had left almost immediately after the call and driven faster than the speed limit for most of the way, which was exactly what Daniel would have expected and which moved him more than he could easily account for. She came in through the back door the way she always did, the way they had both come in through back doors their whole lives, and she stood in the kitchen and looked at the cake on the counter and then at Daniel, and she said, "You actually made it." He said, "I actually made it." She sat at the table and he cut 2 pieces and poured coffee and sat across from her, and they ate without saying anything for a while. The cake was not identical to their mother's. Daniel knew this, and Ruth knew this, and neither of them said it. It was close in the way that a portrait is close to a face, recognizably the same thing, shaped by the same understanding, but belonging to a different pair of hands. The apples were good. The brown sugar topping had a slight bitterness that he thought was probably the cinnamon, possibly a little too much, which was the right kind of mistake for a first attempt. Ruth said, "It's good, Daniel." He said, "It's not hers?" She said, "No, but it doesn't have to be." He looked at her across the table. Ruth was 63, 3 years younger than him, and she had their mother's way of saying things directly without being unkind about it, which was a skill Daniel had always admired and never quite managed himself. He said, "Did you know she kept notes in all her cookbooks?" Ruth said, "I had no idea. I assumed she just knew everything by memory." He said, "She did know it by memory. The notes were for someone else." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She said, "For us." He said, "I think so. I think she was writing them for whoever was going to need them later. She just didn't know which of us it would be or when." Ruth said, "That is exactly the kind of thing she would do." He thought about this. It was true. Their mother had been a person who prepared for futures she could not see, who planted things she knew she might not live to eat from, who wrote down instructions for people who had not yet thought to ask the question. It had seemed, when they were young, like simple practicality. He understood now that it was something more than that. It was a form of confidence, a belief that the people who came after you would eventually want what you knew, even if they did not know it yet. He will want it someday. Ruth reached across the table and picked up the blue book, which was lying open to the apple cake page. She read the 3 margin notes slowly. When she finished, she set the book down carefully, as if it were something that required care. She said, "She wrote this after Thanksgiving, the year you didn't come." He said, "I know." She said, "I came that year. We had the cake, and she didn't say anything about you not being there, but she must have been thinking about it." He said, "She didn't say anything because she didn't want to make it a thing." Ruth said, "She never made anything a thing, even when it was." They sat with that for a while. The October afternoon was going toward evening outside the window, the maple at the end of the yard deepening from red to something darker, the light flattening and going gold. Daniel thought about his mother standing at this kind of window, or a window very like it, in the farmhouse kitchen, looking out at the end of a day. He had seen her do that many times without thinking about what she was seeing or what she was thinking. He had been in the room and not in the room, the way young people are present in the rooms of their parents, physically there and mentally elsewhere, already half gone toward the lives waiting for them somewhere else. He said, "I should have come that Thanksgiving." Ruth said, "Yes, but she knew why you didn't, and she made the cake anyway, and she wrote it down, and she waited." He said, "That's the part I keep coming back to." Ruth said, "I know, me too." He cut two more pieces of the cake. Outside, the maple held its dark red against the fading afternoon, and the kitchen was warm, and the coffee was still hot, and the blue book lay open on the table between them, its margins full of their mother's handwriting, a long conversation she had been having with the future without ever knowing exactly who would read it. Daniel thought about the farmhouse and the orchard and the Sunday pot roast and the bread that had appeared every week for 23 years, like a fact of nature that required no acknowledgment. He thought about all the meals he had eaten with the particular inattention of someone who expects the meal to keep arriving, who has not yet understood that there will come a time when it does not. He thought about his own children who were grown now and living in other cities, and who came home when they could, and not always when he would have liked. He thought about what he cooked for them when they visited, which was not much, which was something he could change. He thought about what he knew that he had not written down. Ruth said, "Are you going to make this again?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Will you teach me?" He said, "I don't know enough yet to teach anyone. I made it once." She said, "Then we'll figure it out together." He thought about that. Two people at a kitchen table with a slim blue book between them, working their way through the margins of a life, learning what they should have learned years ago and finding, against all reasonable expectation, that the learning was still possible, still good, still worth doing. He said, "I found a note about the bread on page 34. She spent years getting it right." Ruth said, "Show me." He turned to page 34 and slid the book across the table, and Ruth leaned over it the way she had leaned over things their whole lives, with her whole attention, her coffee cup pushed to one side, and her elbows on the table, and her eyes moving carefully across the words. He watched her reading their mother's handwriting, and he thought, "This is what she left us, not the recipes, the attention, the willingness to try again, the belief that the people you love will eventually want what you know, even when they do not yet know that they want it." He thought, "I am 66 years old, and I made a cake today for the first time in my life, and it was not as good as hers, and I am going to make it again next week and the week after that until my hands know what hers knew." And he thought, that is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Ruth looked up from the book. She said, "She made this bread every single week?" He said, "Every week for years." Ruth shook her head slowly. She said, "I never thought about how long that took." He said, "Neither did I." She said, "We should have." He said, "Yes, but we're thinking about it now." Outside, the maple held its color against the darkening sky, and the kitchen was warm, and the blue book was open on the table between them, and in the margin of page 34 their mother's handwriting waited, patient and clear, saying everything she had always meant to say. End of novel.